Evelyn, could you tell us a bit more about your research and subsequently the book you wrote?
Yes, I'm happy to do that. So we have received a grant. Then we have put together a team. We are 4 in this team. Professor Chris Rowe of the University of University of Northampton in the United Kingdom. His colleague, Dr. Callum Cooper, and David Lorimer, who is Program Director of the Scientific and Medical Network. So we are 4 in the core team, but we do collaborate with additional universities who work with us on punctual subjects, and these universities are in the States and in France, and then we work together on a paper on a specific issue on the basis of our data. So this was a 2-year survey in 3 languages, English, French, and Spanish. We have elaborated a very detailed questionnaire of close to 200 questions, 196 to be precise, which has been filled in by 1,004 participants. The result of this research findings of this research have been published in 2 booklets, which are called Investigation of the Phenomenology and Impact of Spontaneous and Direct After-Death Communications. We have research findings and we have cases. So we present our research findings, and in cases there are also a good amount of accounts, of quotes of our participants. These booklets can be downloaded for free on my website. You're welcome to go there and upload those booklets. And then, of course, I have written a book presenting our research findings in French, Contact spontané avec, défunt, which has just been translated into German, Spontane Kontakte mit Verstorbenen. And this same book will be published in Spanish next year. And I hope it is under review with a publisher in the United States, and I hope it will also be published in English soon.
For the last 30 years, you've been researching NDEs, and for the last 10 years, you've been researching this particular one. I've read in your book.
Absolutely.
You wrote a book with Kenneth Ring.
Yes.
And impressive. What made you change to this particular kind of research? I believe, as you told us as far, that it was because you realized that there wasn't that much research or that much literature available on this particular topic. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. I was always interested in ADCs, spontaneous ADCs, not by mediumship, which is also very interesting, but that's not my topic. And then when I looked into it a little bit closer, I started by translating Hello from Heaven, the book of Bill and Judy Guggenheim. I translated it from English into French. And when I was translating all these beautiful accounts, I thought, well, this is really a fascinating subject. I would like to know more about it. So I wrote an article in Inexploré, which is the magazine of INRES. And I asked for testimonies, and I received a couple of testimonies, not so many, about 50, but that was the basis for my first book, which was in fact my 4th book, but my first book on ADCs. Quand les défunts viennent à nous, when I talk about ADCs, and I used the testimonies which were sent to me as a result of the call for testimonies I had made. And then I received hundreds of emails. And then, since I have received so many testimonies of people who said, I am so relieved to know that I'm not the only one who had this experience. I thought I was, maybe different from other people. I thought I was the only one. This experience was so important to me. It was so beautiful, but I didn't even know it had a name, and it was research. And I'm so relieved and pleased to know that now, your book exists, and that I'm not the only one, that other people have also this experience. And that's when I thought, now the time has really come to do a research about this phenomenon, which is so current, and people have those experiences, and they think they are the only ones because nobody talks about it. And that's when I got the grant, and I constituted this team, and we started our survey, because it was really, really about time to study ADCs. That is how it went.
The title of that book is Contact spontané avec un défunt, which is freely translated spontaneous contacts with a deceased person. The subtitle says une enquête scientifique atteste la réalité des VSCD. Would you mind explaining to us what a VSCD is?
Yes. It's a vécu subjectif de contact avec un défunt. Meaning in English, it's subjective experience of having a contact with a deceased person.
But it's still subjective in the sense that it's a personal kind of experience.
Yes, it is subjective because an experience is always subjective.
Yeah.
But when you do research and you collect as many testimonies as we did, then you have objective data. I think it is very important to disseminate the current knowledge about ADCs very broadly, because those experiences are not known by the public, and yet 50 to 60% of the people have them. They know it's true, for them it's true, they're convinced it's authentic. Only 1% of our participants are not convinced that the deceased people can indeed contact living persons. Only 1% is not convinced. All the others are sure my experience was real. So you see, people have those experiences, but in the view of Western societies, it's not possible to have a contact with a deceased person, because apparently at death of the physical body, everything ends. So these people are there with this experience, which is so important for them. It was so moving, it was so beautiful to have this contact, with the person they loved and who passed away. It's so important for them, but it's difficult to integrate it in their conception of reality, because it doesn't fit at all with what we are told in school and at university, what the nature of reality, which is probably different from what we have been taught. So it is very important to talk about ADCs, to make this knowledge we have now available accessible to as many people as possible, because everybody can have an ADC one day. And we saw it also in our survey, people who had pre-existing knowledge, they immediately could just enjoy the experience, except asking themselves, but how is this possible? Am I hallucinating? How can this happen? They know already those experiences do happen, and they can just enjoy it.
Yes, well, again, those figures, I agree with you, that's perhaps a conservative figure. I think it was 2008, the University of Göteborg in Sweden,
yes,
I remember now, did a survey, and 82% of widows and widowers surveyed reported one or more contacts, visits from their deceased spouse or or friend or whatever it may be. And yet the American Association, Psychiatric Association, cataloged them and are still cataloging them as hallucinations. So that
yeah, well, they will have to change their point of view because it just doesn't match the data at all. But to get back to what you said for widow and widowers, in our group of participants, only 13% were widows and widowers. So it is not the biggest part of our participants who were widows or widowers. And it's also interesting to see that being bereaved is not a precondition to have an ADC. You can have this experience without being bereaved. Our data show that 27% of our participants were not bereaved anymore. They were bereaved, but that time has passed. They're not bereaved anymore, or they were never grieving the deceased person they perceived. So being bereaved is not a precondition for having an ADC. And I think that's important to stress, because very often skeptics say, well, it's just a hallucination because people were so sad that they had lost their loved one that they imagine having had this experience. But that's not what the data says, you see. And also our data show that 12% of our participants perceived the person they didn't know. But that's interesting.
I had a friend reading the book also, and he said, well, 62%, if I'm not mistaken, of participants were visited by their loved ones while they were asleep.
That is true. But it should be added that 52% of them were woken up by the contact.
Okay.
And then it integrated itself into one of the other categories, that is to say a visual ADC, a tactile ADC, an olfactory ADC, or an auditory ADC, or just the impression of sensing a presence of the deceased. So indeed, 62% had experience when they were asleep, but then either they were woken up or they kept sleeping, but they said it was completely different from a dream. It has nothing to do with a dream. It was very real, very coherent. I remember every detail of it, even 10 years after it happened, 20 years after it happened, whereas a dream, normally we forget it quite easily. So they said it was completely different from a dream.
You know, people are grieving, so...
well, you see, there are other...
It's a way of coping with their grief, which
yes.
is very often said, of course.
Absolutely, no, of course. But of course, sometimes people are deeply, deeply grieving and they have these experiences, that's for sure, but not always. For 27% of our participants, it was not the case. And you see, there are also other types of ADCs when people are not grieving. For example, crisis ADCs. A crisis ADC occurs when somebody is informed of the death of a loved one by the person, him or herself. For example, let's say they are sleeping, they're woken up, they see their mother standing in front of them, telling them, I am leaving now, I came to say goodbye. And then the phone rings 10 minutes after, and the hospital informs the person that their mother had just passed away. So these are crisis ADCs. Now, when the experience happens, they're not bereaved yet, because of course, they didn't know yet that the mother had just passed away. So in crisis ADCs, people are not yet bereaved. Then there are ADCs for a third person. They are quite common when somebody receives a message for somebody who is bereaved, and the message is usually, to transmit that they're still alive and they're well. And they tell their family member or friend, don't be so sad, stop crying, I'm fine, I'm still alive. I can see what's going on in your life, I'm watching over you. But the recipient, the person who has the experience, is not bereaved. Then also, as we said, we have the experiences with unknown deceased person. Of course, you are not bereaved of a person you don't know. And also ADCs for warning and protection. They happen very often, many years, even decades after the demise. And they serve to prevent an imminent danger, to inform the recipient that something really dangerous is going to happen, and it can be avoided thanks to this warning. And very often these people are not bereaved anymore. For example, somebody was warned from a danger from his deceased grandfather, but the grandfather died when the recipient was still a child, for example. So in all these cases, of course, the person who has the experience is not bereaved. And also what I could add here is that 50%, about 50% of experiences happen in the first year after the demise, with a high concentration in the first 24 hours and up to 7 days. Then during the first year after the demise, and then it can still happen, of course, but in a decreasing manner from 2 to 5 years. ADCs that happens later are more rare. They can still happen. They can happen 20 years after the death, 30 years after the death, but they are more rare.
Of course, all of this implies that there is an afterlife.
All of this implies absolutely that there is afterlife, but this is not a proof, you know.
Are you personally convinced of the reality of this experience and of an afterlife?
I'm 100% convinced. But this is just my personal conviction, which is not so important or interesting. What is interesting is that only 1% of the persons we have surveyed are not convinced that there is life after death. All the others are convinced, yes, there is survival of consciousness after bodily death, because they say, I have experienced it and now I know it. And as a correlate, of course, they are convinced that something beautiful is waiting for us once we die, because they had this positive, beautiful experience. They had all these emotions they could share with the deceased. They felt how they were happy. They were relieved to have left, you know, their body behind them, which maybe was very sick or very elderly. All these problems they had at the end of their life are now behind them, and now they're in the light, now they're happy. So of course the recipients, they're convinced that what is awaiting us after death is something really, really beautiful.
Of course, there will always be those skeptics, materialists, who will claim and tell us that this was a way of coping with, you know, with the death of a loved one, and that they were hallucinations.
But you know, for me, it's fine. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. For me, it's really not a problem. And you know, the aim of our survey was not to prove that ADCs are authentic. It was not to prove that there is life after death. It was just to look into the experience people have. What happened to them? How did it unfold? What did it change in their life? What is their opinion now of life and death? Did it affect their fear of death, of their own death? Yes, it did. It did. we saw that 30% said their fear of their own death was reduced, and 31% said it was reduced, and 30% said it was completely eliminated. So they said they have no fear of death anymore. You see how powerful these experiences are, how important they are in the life of the people who have them. 71 said that they treasured their experience, and 20% said they were very glad they had it. So it's like a tournant in their life. You see, something important happened, they will never forget it. They will share it with the people they feel comfortable in sharing it with. And it just changed their whole attitude. We saw that their spirituality has doubled as a result of the experience, but their religiosity has not changed much, because this is not a religious experience, it's a spiritual experience. So it's very important in the life of the person. It helped them to cope with the grief of bereavement. Of course, the physical absence is what is the most difficult to accept. And this is just a fact, and that's what we all have to deal with. This is not going away. We also need to go through the grieving process. This is also necessary with or without ADC. But you know, they have this impression of a continued bond with a deceased loved one. They seem to be still alive and well and at their side and helping them to cope with this difficult period of bereavement. They feel much less alone. And it's just very, very helpful. Most of them said it brought them emotional healing. And yes, it's just a very, very comforting, very reassuring, and really beautiful experience.
Okay. But it's a bit the same like with NDEs. So the fact that people realize at a certain moment in time that they are not crazy. That's very often what I get to hear. You know, that other people have the same experience, and
it's helpful.
That alone means a lot to those people, you know.
No, because, you know, it seems to be so contradictory of what we think about reality. That's really the problem. The problem is the nature of reality. The way we look at reality in our Western countries say these experiences cannot happen. So when you have them, you think, how can I live something that is impossible? And that is not easy. They know it's true for them. They're convinced. They're 100% sure. Yes, my deceased father has contacted me. I saw him. I spoke with him. I felt his love. He gave me information. I know it's true, but apparently it's impossible. So how can I handle this? This is why it is so important to speak about ADC.
That's a difficult one, I think, for myself. Do you think we will eventually be able, at will, to talk to deceased persons? I'm thinking of the soul phone. Have you heard about this one? No, engineers are working on.
I heard it. Of course, I did hear about it. Well, you see, there are many traditions and practices and yes, traditions when the living try to contact the deceased. That is probably as old as humanity. That's nothing new. But we are now researching spontaneous contacts. This is our research subject. We don't study the contacts which are initiated by the living person or apparently initiated by the living person. Of course, the most common way of contacting deceased persons is mediumship, which is very interesting. They have sometimes really amazing results. But this is not our research subject. We only study and investigate spontaneous contacts.
The contact is always, the initiative of the contact is always from the deceased to the living. Very seldom the other way around. Is that correct?
It is never the other way around. You cannot provoke a spontaneous contact with a deceased loved one. You cannot do that. It is always the deceased who contacts the living person, always.
Right. The message which I've read this also, the message people receive from their deceased loved ones is usually twofold. It's we love you, we still love you, and we still exist, which seems to be really important to them, you know, to be able to tell you that, or tell their family or their loved ones that they still exist. Am I correct in saying that those are the two?
Absolutely correct, yes.
The two main messages they
You're right, yes.
The fact that so many people filled in that long survey tells us that this experience was really important to them.
Exactly.
It seems a little bit like, similar to near-death stories, that they are sort of relieved that they finally can talk about it, write about it.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. They don't speak about it easily because they're afraid of not being believed, you know.
Yeah.
Or people could say, but you're crazy, or it's just because you're bereaved. So it's very painful for them. And they were apparently really pleased to be able to participate in this survey. It took them 2 to 3 hours to fill in the questionnaire, which is really long. But very few dropped out along the way. Almost all of them finished the whole questionnaire. And that showed us that indeed they were very pleased to be able to talk about it in a secure environment.
What would your advice be to people who have such an experience and are afraid to talk about it?
Would I advise them to talk about it?
Yes.
Yes, but probably they should choose to whom they talk about it. Because it can be very painful for them if they're not believed. So I think it's a very personal experience. Of course, if they want to share it, they can share it, no question. But you know, they might have feedback which they're not very happy with. So I think they should choose the people they talk to about it.
Have you ever come up against, after that, communication between people who didn't like each other when alive?
Well, what happens in an after-death communication, sometimes there is a forgiving process going on. For example, people had difficulties, relational difficulties, and during the ADC, they could heal. You know, they could fix this relationship. They understood the reasons of the other person, the point of view of the other person, and understand what happened when it went wrong. Why did it go wrong? And then they can forgive each other. And thus, these experiences are very powerful because instead of still being angry with the deceased person, they can then bereave in good conditions because the anger and the frustration have gone away thanks to the after-death communication.
The reactions, I mean, you must have had reactions from perhaps peers or the public, general public.
Yes,
what are the reactions
yes.
up to date on your book?
Well, you see, there is a lot of research being done on consciousness research now. So this has become quite a topic in the academic field. From many disciplines, people think about these experiences. They think about what is consciousness? Is it primary? Does it exist outside of the brain? And yes, there is a lot of interest, I would say, from the academia. And the general public, there's a lot of interest. I can see it with the sales figures of my book, which are a good indicator. I see that people are interested in these experiences.
Do you think that your research will trigger, or perhaps already happened, trigger other research and further research in this kind of subject?
Yes, well, I'm pretty sure it will. We have just received follow-up grants, so we have started the second phase of our research project. That is one thing that is going on. Sorry. Okay. Because the person was talking on the phone, so I will start again. Yes, there will certainly be follow-up studies. I'm convinced of that. We have just received follow-up grants. So we have started the second phase of our research project. We will replicate our survey by using, of course, the same questionnaire in additional countries, starting with Germany. But then we would also like to do the same survey in countries with different cultural and religious background. It will be very interesting to compare. But I'm pretty sure, and it's already starting, that other researchers are also doing research on ADCs. We just hope it will be like a more general movement now towards trying to understand better those spontaneous contacts with deceased persons. It will be probably a little bit like it was with NDEs. Now we have 50 years of very serious, very rigorous research about NDEs. I think and I hope the same thing will happen with ADCs, but it will take a little bit of time.